Let's talk about another problem that can happen in teams. And to introduce that, I want to talk about the origin of the discovery of that phenomenon, which is the Bay of Pigs fiasco that happened in 1961 with Kennedy and his advisors. Anybody remembers the history class and about the Bay of Pigs fiasco? Can you remind us what it was, or what you remember about it?
But something was messed up with the intelligence. They were ambushed if people knew.
Yep. Yeah, that's a good, basic summary of it. So, just before Kennedy was elected, there was a revolution in Cuba, a communist revolution, where Fidel Castro took power and defeated a dictator who was called Batista. And at the time, Cuba was the playground of, it was a playground for Americans. It was a resort destination. So the dictator was, Batista was a friend to the United States. And there were a lot of hotels and casinos and American interests there. And and it's very close to the US. And America had this doctrine during the Cold War that South America is its backyard. South and Central America and the Caribbean are its background. And they should avoid at all costs communist contagion there so that it doesn't spread in the American continent. Right? So when there was a Cuban revolution, it was a big deal as a sort of chess move in the Cold War. And Kennedy, having just been elected, there was a big test of his leadership. Now, he was a Democratic president, and Democratic presidents are often thought to be potentially weaker on international issues, not as tough as Republican presidents. So it was a big test of like, well, how is he going to react to that? He's going to be tough enough on this. But you also have to manage the potential confrontation that could occur with the USSR, in particular the nuclear equilibrium that was existing. So if you go and attack Cuba directly, you might risk a nuclear confrontation with the USSR. So what was the solution? So very quickly after being elected, Kennedy and his advisors devised a scheme to create a counter-revolution. But instead of it being American, so instead of sending American troops, the idea was take Cuban exiles. So some people in Cuba, people often who benefited from the Batista regime, fled Cuba, came to the United States. A lot of them, you still find in Florida, in the area. And they were willing to, if they were armed and trained by the US, they were willing to try to take back power in Cuba. So this group was trained covertly somewhere by the CIA, somewhere in South America. And they were sent to land here in the Bay of Pigs. And the idea was they would march. This is an area close. There's a road right there that they would join, and they would march into Havana and take power. Right? The idea was the U.S. Air Force and Navy would provide support in a covert way. So there would be unmarked American planes taking control of the air first, wiping out the Cuban Air Force. And then after the troops had landed, some Navy ships would come and give them supply, tanks, jeeps, heavy weapons. And what happened was a disaster. So the whole thing didn't play out at all as it was expected to play out. The first problem was the choice of the area. So remember, this is 1961. No satellite, no spy satellites that tell you exactly. No Google Earth that tells you what the terrain looks like. Nobody knew exactly. I mean, it was kind of hard to obtain intelligence on the terrain. So, but still, you had spy planes that could have been used. But the Bay of Pigs is actually a swampy area that's a very bad place to land in because you can't really cross those swamps and reach the road that goes to Havana. So that's the first problem. The vehicles would not be able to cross the swamps. The second problem was a major underestimation of the Cuban Air Force. The idea was we'll assign a few American planes who are very advanced and much better than the assumption, much better than the Cuban Air Force, and we'll wipe them out very quickly. This never happened. The Cuban Air Force was much better trained. The planes there were more planes. They were not as bad as the U.S. thought. So the U.S. Air Force was not able to take control of the air. Hard to believe, but they couldn't fight. They couldn't fight off the Cuban Air Force. Now that's the end of in any kind of theater. If you don't take control of the air, that's the end of it. If you can't take control of the air, you can't have ships come and land and deliver material because the Cuban Air Force is going to bomb those ships and stop them from. So you see in any war now, you start by wiping out, or at least if you're the U.S. with the biggest military, you wipe out the Air Force. Look at what happened in Iraq, the first war of Iraq. First thing is you take out all of their Air Force. And then you have ground invasion, and if you have a sea aspect, you have a landing by sea. So with the Cuban Air Force not being wiped out, the few troops that did land never received their material, and so they were captured, and it was a huge embarrassment for Kennedy and the U.S. because the idea was also to hide the fact that the U.S. was behind this, but of course it was very hard to hide this once the men were made prisoner, and Fidel Castro was gloating, showing the world, look at, the U.S. is trying to pick on us and they can't even take us out, and so big embarrassment. So why am I telling you about this? After this, there's a psychologist called Irving Janis, a social psychologist, who studied the decision-making that occurred between Kennedy and his advisors and wrote a book about it called Groupthink. And his question was, how is it possible that smart, well-trained people like Kennedy and his advisors, who made a lot of good decisions later in their administration, but how is it that they made such a bad decision? How did the group decision-making become such a bad, so bad, given that usually we think groups are better at making complex decisions, right? So he did a lot of research, interviewed the key decision makers, the key people who were involved in that, and groupthink summarizes a dysfunctional type of syndrome. It's a syndrome, that's how Janis calls it, that groups can fall prey to and make bad decisions. So what's the definition of groupthink? A mode of thinking that individuals engage in when pressures towards conformity become so dominant in a team that they override appraisal of alternative courses of action. So you recall from last class that one of the factors we viewed that makes teams more effective is when you have multiple people's opinions on the table. So we all of us, however smart we are, however well educated we are, only see a portion of reality, a facet of reality. We're missing part of the picture. So having other people see something else and say, I see these facets, and this other person say, well, I see these facets. And sometimes you have major disagreements. When we see different facets of the same phenomenon, sometimes you say you're crazy, or you're wrong, or you're immoral to see it that way. Right? But here you have the power of teams is bring all of these, have conflict, have discussion, have coalition building, have find a way to build a puzzle. And when you have a lot of people with different opinions that see more of the situation, that will allow you to make better decisions, right? Because you have the type of information you need. So imagine when you have a team where people are afraid of expressing their view of reality, or one person dominates the discussion and imposes their point of view and everybody else falls in line, then you're not going to have a powerful, effective decision making. That's how dictators fall. Imagine Kim Jong-un, right, the leader of North Korea, gets his generals around him, and we know what happens to generals in North Korea, right? If they criticize his haircuts, they get obliterated by a shell, or tortured in all kinds of other ways. So Kim Jong-il tells them, "This is what I think we should do. What do you think the generals say?" "Oh yes, great idea. Great leader. You're right." So you never have the potential when you have a dictator or a strong personality for dissent. Now Kennedy was no dictator. Kennedy was no Kim Jong-il. This was still a democratic apparel. But there were a few things that happened. The first thing was Kennedy had just been elected, and he had won with a very high margin, and he was in the honeymoon phase of his presidency. So when you first have been elected in a landslide, people think for a moment that everything you do is right. People don't want to criticize you. Everybody wants to agree. Everybody's happy. Everybody's like, yeah, we have one with the best people right now in America. So, people were enamored with Kennedy. His advisors were enamored with him, and they were enamored with each other. They thought they were just like, they didn't question themselves very much. They were like, well, they were on a high, if you will. They were overconfident. Kennedy was charismatic, and people liked him. People wanted to agree with him. So that's the first factor of conformity. Everybody was like, yeah, what Kennedy says, I agree. That's cool. I think it's smart. The second thing that happened was Kennedy's brother was the Attorney General, and he was participating in those conversations. And he had this idea that anybody who disagreed with his brother was being disloyal, was kind of threatening the Kennedy clan, that you had to be loyal to the Kennedy clan, and showing your loyalty meant agreeing with them. So when people disagreed with Kennedy in discussions, his brother would find them after the meeting, or corner them at cocktail parties, and tell them, you've been disloyal to the president. Why are you being disloyal? Now, this happens, right? This has happened with other presidents. So the effect of that was to shut people off. People were afraid to now, it's not just disagreeing with a charismatic president, but his brother is telling me that I'm being disloyal if I disagree. Right? The idea of yes men, creating yes men around a leader, right? People who say yes, people who agree, destroys the power of teams. Other things that occurred, secrecy was very important. So any CIA operation is involved in secrecy, especially an operation of this kind. So, and another factor was time pressures. The idea was we need to do something fast, and we can't have too many people know about this. So experts that could have corrected some of the misconceptions that the group had were not consulted. So you have people in the Air Force that could have been consulted. The Air Force has its own intelligence service who could have said, the Cuban Air Force is better than we think. Those planes are not as shitty as you think, or whatever else. I can imagine easily people laughing at the Cuban Air Force and thinking we'll rub it out in a minute. Somebody else might have questioned that. But external experts were not considered, were not involved. So essentially, those are some of the dimensions that lead to groupthink. So groupthink can happen when you have authoritarian leaders, like dictators. It can happen when you have very charismatic leaders who everybody falls in love with. Think about celebrities. How celebrities lose track with reality. Everybody treats them as God, and they lose track of reality because nobody disagrees with them. Nobody tells them they're wrong. Nobody tells them, that's not okay to do that, or this idea is stupid, or this song doesn't work. And that's how people lose it. People who get to the top eventually lose contact with reality and reality testing. That happens really, in government, in organization. You go to the top, you're more successful. You become more potentially prey to groupthink. So it's very important to have somebody who can criticize you. If you rise to the top and can still have somebody who tells you the truth, have a safeguard, or listen to really ask people to tell you the truth and not punish them when they tell you the truth you don't want to hear, but actually listen and thank them for it. That's a very thing. If some of you rise really high at some point in your life, I hope you remember that.